welcome back to Unite Plan. It's been a while, hasn't it, Paul?
Just a little bit.
We had a little break, everyone's busy with washing, the cooking and stuff. So, but after a bit of a break for a few months, we're back, and this is our first kind of proper talk we've done for a while. And what better guest to have to welcome back in the Kitchen Revelation, Andrew Johnson.
Hello everyone, and thanks for inviting me back. I'm glad you've been able to sort of get things coordinated again to do another recording, so that's great. Thanks for inviting me.
Very good, Thank you. And it's been a while. Welcome back, Andrew. Back into the Kitchen of Revelation. Still as familiar as ever?
Well, indeed. It's almost like deja vu, I suppose, but there's such a lot been happening. But I've been sort of trying to take a bit of a back seat and just... like I've been away a couple of times, and I've had my own university work to get on with and stuff, and had a sort of bit of a change in domestic circumstances for good reasons. So but I've still been trying to keep up with various things that get posted, but also not get too drawn into the various scenarios to the point where I just get depressed with things, and trying to sort of, whilst observing things, at least, have some sort of detachment and look at why certain things are being, given attention.
The world's temperatures are rising, and so are people's energy bills.
Yeah. And that includes both from the mainstream side, or the shamestream side, as I generally now call it, and from the alternative side. Yes. Yeah. Because both sides, as we know, kind of have different narratives that they work to. And we hope that the stuff that we get into is the more truthful narratives. But nevertheless, some people make claims beyond what the evidence actually supports. Yes. Yeah.
Or ignore it.
Or they ignore it, indeed. Yeah. And this applies to most of the topics that you and I have talked about. You have talked about the other guests. COVID being one, 9/11 being one, and all the stuff that's come out since we last spoke about the situation in the Ukraine. Even with that one, for example, I didn't want to get drawn into the Ukraine sort of narrative, partly because I suppose I'd got a bit fed up of all these scenarios being presented to us. And essentially forced in front of us, and for example, to see. In fact, a chap sent me a picture taken from his back garden. One of my readers from the Check the Evidence website, and from his back garden he could see two Ukraine flags in adjoining gardens. Just the sort of top flagpoles and that. And I'm thinking, so people have gone straight out of the COVID narrative, which have kind of dropped off considerably. It's still, of course, there, but the restrictions and so forth that were in place have all but disappeared. Certainly domestically in the UK, they have. It's not quite the same in some other countries, as we know. And then they just go straight into this Ukraine narrative.
So I love it when I see people, you have no idea what difference it makes when you see people putting something even on their window, just a little flag, just a little message of support, just hashtag stand with Ukraine or anything like that. You see that on people's windows and it's really encouraging. And what I would like is, I know that there's a really strong feeling among not just Ukrainians, but people who aren't Ukrainian. I'm not Ukrainian. And we have a really strong feeling, both me and my husband, my whole family, against this horrible war.
And for people that have not researched this, probably many of your viewers will have researched it probably more than I have. Yeah. The first thing that I was made aware of was that the president of the Ukraine, Zelensky, I forget which is his name, who's now president of the Ukraine. In 2015, and you probably heard this, he was in a TV series as an actor playing the president of the Ukraine.
You could make it up, but
you
don't have to.
Василий Петрович Голобородько. Доброе утро, господин президент.
Это кто? Наверное, мы.
This is never spoken of in the mainstream, and then you get into all this discussion of whether a lot of the footage from the Ukraine has been staged in one way.
And inside the holy grail of Putin's ambitions, the Ukrainian capital, Kiev.
7 News gave us that ominous display of Russian military might and showed it again on the late news that night. But if you thought that formation of 10 fighter jets looked a little bit sus, well, you'd be right. Because the original footage is of a Moscow air parade 2 years ago.
But then, you ask yourself, and I haven't really studied this, many viewers will perhaps post comments on this video when you publish it. Is this a narrative to demonise Russia? And then people have said, oh, well, Putin is really a good guy. He's working with the QAnon group to, fight the globalists, and all of this. And you can make an argument that might be true. And Putin certainly has said some strange things. And I remember watching a video about him talking about the misrepresentation of Russia in the Western press, and most of it to me made sense.
Пригласил вас для того, чтобы поговорить о вопросах, связанных с экономикой, с финансами. Мы с Михаилом Владимировичем обсуждали эту тему, имея в виду, конечно, и те санкции, которые сейчас так называемое западное сообщество, как я его назвал в своем выступлении, это империя лжи, пытается реализовать в отношении.
But then at the same time, you can find pictures of Putin with Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum, from 4 or 5 years ago, shaking hands with the guy. How does that factor in? Because of course, the WEF, which has been driving a large part of the COVID narrative, those members, and that was pretty well established. And then I posted on my Facebook profile, probably about 4 or 5 weeks ago, a clip from an article from 2018 about the World Economic Forum and their plans, I think, for a digital currency and plans towards that. And that, again, was from like 4 years ago, before all of the COVID stuff. And there's quite a lot of themes. It was posted on Vigilant Citizen, which have come out, from the WEF, which have been talked about within the COVID narrative. So again, you seem to go from group to group when you look at who's causing all this, this enslavement of humanity. I hadn't heard of the World Economic Forum 4 years ago. I knew about the meetings at Davos. Oh, yeah. But 4 or 5 years ago, more people were talking about the Bilderberger Group, and hardly anybody talks about them now. People talk about the Zionists, instigating all these plots, and maybe the Zionists are behind all the thrust for a digital currency, and then we'll say, well, it's all the Freemasons, and I've said this before. So you get all the fingers pointed at these various groups, and I always wonder. I don't disagree that, for example, it's clear that the World Economic Forum have got a huge stake in the COVID narrative and what they're trying to force into society from that.
You see the agendas lining up with it. Yes.
And you can clearly see on their website, for example, the other thing which has been very much present on our minds, or been forced onto us by the shame stream, is the climate change again. That they've now given that another reboot because of all the hot weather we've had in the UK. That we're all going to die and all our houses are going to burn down because we're reaching 37 degrees rather than 30 degrees. They blithely disregard the fact that it's regularly 40 degrees centigrade in the summer in places like Turkey and Portugal, and they manage to survive with few, if any, problems. Yes, they might have a siesta in the afternoon, but I think that's about it. And they certainly have less water to play with than we do in most of those countries. So, really, again, the shame stream media is creating problems for us to be fearful of. By and large, and that appears to be their job, and that hasn't changed. It's just the narratives which change, and the emphasis on particular parts of those narratives which change. And So and I think you can then, as I've said before, and I was saying earlier, you can fall into this trap of looking at the alternative narratives, and you get the same result. Like people are talking about prepping because we know that the stock market's been going down, and a couple of people have said to me, "Well, I think things are going to kick off in the autumn. We're going to have food shortages, we're going to have other shortages of other resources." But of course, people were saying this that would happen 2, 3, 4 months after the COVID thing got going in 2020.
Yeah.
And I talked about prepping with people that I know, and I never really did anything. Of course, we know that Richard D. Hall did his video on the prepping of his house, which I think was very useful. Don't get me wrong. I think there's certain elements of prepping to make yourself more self-sufficient of great, and I think what Richard did was great. But for the average person, should you prep? And if anybody asks me that question, I just say, well, I don't really know, because from my experience, the predictions of the future mostly turn out to be wrong, and of course they're very clear in hindsight. Like for example. We can look at Event 201. I'm sure we've spoken about that before, and you've probably spoken about it with other guests, your guests and speakers. And it's all very easy to say, well, Event 201 was in October 2019, and then we had COVID in 2020. But nobody was able to say in 2019, we're going to have this global pandemic out, and actually prevent it from happening. Nobody obviously did that, because it actually did happen. So, of course, things are much clearer in hindsight. This is. I remember reading some prediction about somebody said that based on a video, certain events of 9/11 would happen, and they did. So that same person then looked at another video. I think it was to do with this guy who was walking a tightrope between the twin towers. There's some video about this guy, and the guy that was looking at this video said that there were certain clues, as to when 9/11 would happen and what would happen. It was embedded in this tightrope walking act or something, or the guy that was doing it. I forget the exact thing. And then he did another video saying that based on that, he decoded another video using the same methods, and he was convinced that a certain event was going to unfold on 31st of October 2018 or something, and it would be a huge terrorist attack on Chicago or something. I forget the exact prediction, but didn't happen. Even though this other decoding thing was like spot on, very detailed. So that I suppose brings me to a topic which has kind of come into my thoughts more recently. I've recently met somebody, and then we talked about the law of attraction. And there are videos. This became popular, I think, in the early 2000s, and we had videos like The Secret, which I think came out in maybe mid 2000s, I think, or around then. And it's got various people in this video about how you attract into your life things which resonate with your own vibrational state. So, in other words, if you get very depressed about things and you get very negative, you've more of a tendency to attract negative things into your life. And vice versa, if you remain positive and, you put out this positive energy, it's much more likely that you will attract positive things into your life. And you can actually work with this if you focus your attention properly and manifest things. You get this word of manifestation, actually manifesting things in your life. I think this all ties together. In other words, me going on about these narratives, both the mainstream and the alternative narratives, that ties into this law of attraction, I think. Let's take, for example, the topic of free energy, which you and I think have talked about on more than one occasion. If you can suppress the talk of free energy technologies being able to be used for a more peaceful and more equitable world, less environmental destruction and so forth, or even zero environmental destruction, if you can think about that concept in a positive way, and you know that there's evidence to show that this can be done, we've talked about this, and those that haven't seen this, you can have a look at a talk I did a few years ago called Infinite Energy, but not for the masses. There's several versions of that on YouTube. I maybe done one of the talks with you guys on the same sort of topics. But if you look at there are a couple that are well filmed. There's one by Global BEM, which I did in 2012, and there's another one by Awakened State YouTube channel. That was the following year, and that's got a slightly different version. And I go through all the evidence, that these devices have been produced, like a generator which you can just flick the switch on. You might have to turn a handle, and then it will run itself, and you can run your house off it basically.
Now, again, it's a bit one of these expressions when you start to look into these free energy inventions and so on, and you really start to try and take all the information in. It's like drinking from a fire hose. There is so much stuff out there.
If I reset the voltage detection for the switch circuit to detect the voltage drop at about 8 volts and then swap over, the thing will just run for months. I've actually had to stop it in the end because it's just getting on my nerves, it running it back in the shed. So it's actually been running for many months, and I've only just finally plucked up courage to put it on YouTube, if you like.
The key concept, or the key thing in that video, the first one with John Bodini, he was just charging one battery and then taking the battery off and charging another battery and just running the motor off that. That daft man, as he called himself, he'd put in an extra bit of circuit such that the battery that was driving the motor would then be switched to be the battery being charged every so often, and when the voltages became the right way.
Those things are real. They do exist, and I could probably cite you the Yildiz device, the Lutec device, and the Moray, Henry T. Moray, I think was his name, his device in the 1920s, the Lockridge device. Loads of them. You can go and check them out. But if you can successfully suppress knowledge of that, then when you go back to this law of attraction, you can only attract things that you can think about as being real, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So if you are not of the mindset that free energy technology is real, then it's much more difficult for you to manifest that. In other words, you can only think about a new Jaguar car.
Yeah.
You want to manifest that in some way. So you enter a competition or something and you win one or something. Or one of your relatives wins 10 million on the lottery and buys you one. But your thought is only focused on that Jaguar or that house or whatever. But if you'd known that free energy devices were real on a large scale, if you don't know that, you can't manifest it. You're not aware of it, so you can't manifest it. So in other words, you can only manifest the things that you become aware of that are real, specifically. Obviously, you can make dreams you can say, well, I dream of a more peaceful and equitable world, but that's non-specific.
Yes.
So, to me, I think from my understanding, and any viewers that have had more experience on this, the law of attraction works better the more specific you are, and also you can't just sit there and wish for it. You have to take steps yourself, to manifest those things. You can't just sit in a chair and say, well, I want to wake up in the morning and find a 10 million pounds in cash on my doorstep. It doesn't work like that. You've got to actually take some action. So then again, like I was saying, so if you put into the mainstream all this negativity about COVID, about cancer, about climate change.
How dare you?
And basically people's heads are filled with all this negative stuff, then what are they going to manifest? What are you more likely to manifest, on the larger scale? So this to me is where you get into the aspect of controlling people's consciousness by feeding them stuff, concepts and data. Not all of it's lies. Yes, the Amazon rainforests have been chopped down, and corrupt companies are, illegally logging and chopping down vast areas. And yes, it's probably affecting certain aspects of the climate in certain ways. And, so how do you stop that from happening? And of course, then you form a charity or a protest group. But behind all of that, of course, and, I was talking about this with somebody very recently, whereby environmental protest groups, for example, they will be concerned about the overuse of oil, commonly called a fossil fuel, which of course it isn't, or not exclusively anyway. So all these groups say, well, we want to stop the damage to the environment, so we want to encourage people not to use oil. But again, those people that say that, they don't know what happened on 9/11. And they don't know the implications of what happened on 9/11. They think that, Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked an aeroplane, blah, blah, blah. We've covered ad nauseum on this channel, and I have on mine. And or they might think, well, actually, no, that story's not true. That came on the news was a lie. So, they put bombs in the building and they destroyed it that way. Nothing to do with hijackers. That's just a lie. So those are the two narratives. But you guys know, and the people that listen to this channel know, that both of those narratives are untrue. And it was an energy weapon. Provably so. Yeah, exactly. And that's not a theory. You can prove it. So. And one of my objectives really is to increase awareness of those facts, and not only of the facts, but of their implications and their significance, with, I hope, the knock-on effect that people then realise, so all this stuff about wars and nuclear wars and energy scarcity and all this, that's just a lie. That's just a scheme to trick us into swallowing and processing all this negativity about scarcity, about environmental damage. When really, Andrew, you're telling me it does not have to be like that. There is no reason for it other than that some group of people who seem to have some vested interest in making our lives miserable for whatever reason, and making us, largely think that we live in a paradigm of scarcity. It's them that's doing it. It's them that's doing it. And and then so the environmental groups, by and large, will say, oh, we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be using internal combustion engines. We shouldn't be damaging the environment by chopping down trees, by doing things that damage the earth, like mining for lithium everywhere now. So we've now transferred the CO2 problem from the use of oil and all these so-called fossil fuels, which are not fossil fuels. We've now then transferred that problem from that to mining of lithium for the batteries and all the everything. What about all the environmental damage from that? Of course, Tesla stocks have gone off the charts in recent years. I think they've been up and down a bit more recently, and people have realised perhaps that this electric car model isn't. It's gonna the batteries on the electric car model are going to run down. In 5 years maybe, when people realise that these batteries have got to be replaced every 5 or 6 years, or every million miles or whatever rating they're at. A huge cost. Far more cost than filling your tank up with petrol or diesel.
They're just putting that in. They're not putting their negatives in with that because they don't want you to have that vibrational sense of the negative part of the electric cars and that. They just want to keep. They want to keep that in the mindset. So you manifest that.
You continue to manifest it. And the whole idea of a car that travels on four wheels that you have a steering wheel for and a clutch and a brake, although I think it's a bit different on an electric car. I don't think they necessarily have a clutch actually because of the way they work. Maybe that whole paradigm is just ridiculous because again, what we've talked about are things like anti-gravity technology. And if we could just walk out the front door, and I'm sure I've said this before with you guys where we talked about personal freedom. Some people think that it's great to be able to have a bus pass, get on the bus, and go from Derby to Nottingham for nothing or very low cost at any time they like because they're retired. And that's a good definition of freedom, isn't it? But my definition of freedom is I can walk outside the house, I can get into my flying saucer, I can take off with a box of sandwiches, and I can fly around Saturn, and then come back and put my feet up.
That's because you know that technology exists.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yes.
That's my understanding that technology is real, and and so I would like to be able to manifest that. Again, I suppose I'm not in that state where I could, because there are too many other factors which I also know about that would prevent that. In other words, the mainstream media being one, and all these other groups, which I think, again, going back to this idea that we can all be creators, we can all create our own reality. That's I think that is real. I think that's true.
Yeah.
But then the other thing that I've been questioning, thinking about that more, is if you have two people sat next to each other, one wants to create one sort of reality, and the other wants to create something rather different or completely the opposite. Which one wins? Which one wins? So if you've got all these global elites that are using occult practices and black magic and rituals and numerology and other things which you and I sort of have an inkling of, but we don't really know how they work, or even if they work. We suspect, and the things that we've talked about, that there is some important truths there. But in our knowledge, we're not really sure how that works. Is it possible to cast a spell? Is it possible to manifest a demon to, do its bidding? Is that really possible? And under certain circumstances, it seems that yes, it is. But maybe I don't know about you. I've never witnessed such a thing face to face. But so if we're in this manifestation war, if you will, between what we want to manifest and what these other interests and these other entities and these other beings manifest, which one wins? Which one takes precedent? And I think we know the answer to that question, certainly based on the last 2.5, 3 years, where something awful has been manifested across the globe in all countries simultaneously. And despite the best efforts, maybe you guys felt the same. We've all shared the objective of trying to enlighten people and give them information and change their thinking so that they can say, hang on a minute, that's not right. I need to look into this. Maybe I shouldn't be quite so judgmental of this or that, and I really need, to study this more. I think we all share that, sort of mentality and that attitude, which of course is why you guys are doing the YouTube channel and why I'm doing my YouTube channel and all that stuff. So when something like COVID comes along, you hope that enough people have listened to you and begun this process of being critical and thinking critically, and then you find that it just completely wipes everything out, And even a small percentage of the people that you thought wouldn't buy into the narrative of COVID, for example, buy into it in a greater or lesser extent. And you think, what's the point? What's been the point of the last 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years of my life when I've tried to show people that, look, don't take it at face value, don't live in fear, study it, look at the arguments and act accordingly, and then you might end up in a better place, and it can be scary. It can be it can cause problems in your life. Fortunately, in my case, that's not really been the case. I don't think any of this work that I've done has caused me any particular problem. In fact, quite the reverse. It's actually improved the quality of my life. I've no doubt about that. And because of the interactions I've been involved with and the people that I've met and the people that I've corresponded with, it's been a massively positive experience for me.
It's the same with us, isn't it? So everyone we've encountered through this is all positive,
And that, to me, again, is a manifestation of your own attitude to all of this. It's something that you end up manifesting, and maybe not necessarily as a conscious, conscious act or a conscious process. It's something that goes along with this awakening process that you decide that you're going to undertake, and this willingness to open up your heart and your mind to the broader picture. That has been that sort of my thinking over the last, probably since we last spoke. Some of that I know I've said before, but I think some of that seems to have crystallised in my mind. I think since we last spoke, and I've recently learned a bit more about things like Buddhism and mindfulness to some that I've met, and that's been. I knew a bit about that beforehand, and but that has been quite helpful in terms of some of the things I just said about, thinking about the different narratives, thinking about the positive and negative energy, thinking about the effect that has on your psyche and your being, and looking at the interplay of these various things.
Yeah.
And one of the people that I learned about is this, and he's quite well known, but I'd never heard of him before, was Thích Nhất Hạnh, who's called, his shortened name is Thai, and he is a Buddhist, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk, or was rather. He passed away in January this year, 2022. I think it was January, I think it was January 2022 he passed. But he was quite well known. He met up with Martin Luther King in the 60s. Okay. And there's some quite interesting documentaries about him on YouTube. And some of what he says, it's pretty basic stuff to my way of thinking. But there are some interesting crossovers with some of what I've just told you, and some of which I haven't really mentioned in this discussion so far. But what it focuses on is mindfulness, is about thinking about your own state of mind and trying to, essentially, I suppose, the way I would describe it from my understanding of it, is you try and divorce yourself from reality to a large degree. And this, of course, this process takes place by doing meditation. And you do this by changing your breathing pattern. And Thai talks about just, all you do is, you sit and meditate, you think about breathing in, you think about breathing out, and you try and focus your attention on that, just that, nothing else.
When you breathe in, and if you are aware that you are alive, and that is already a miracle. And the greatest miracle is to still be alive. With a practice, you can always remain alive in the present moment. According to the teaching and the practice, it is possible to live happily right in the here and the now. And in our tradition, the practice of mindful breathing and the practice of mindful walking always help us to go home to the present moment in order to live deeply every moment of our daily life.
And through that process, then, you can detach yourself from reality a bit, and you can become an observer. And, you can then process things a bit more rationally, I suppose you might say. I don't think he said that. That's my word, and that. And begin to see things in perhaps a more truthful light when you begin to detach from the reality and to divorce yourself from negative emotions. And he came at this because he was in Vietnam, in the Vietnam War, and he was actually anti both sides. Maybe that's the wrong way of describing it. He was a peacemaker, basically. He didn't necessarily agree with what the Vietnamese government were doing, and of course he didn't agree with what the Americans were doing. He just said, look, let's be peaceful about this. Let's just think about what's going on. And and then he was kicked out of his own country by the Vietnamese government for not going along with their war agenda, really. Which, of course, we can imagine at the top level, this was all sorted out, in these backroom meetings, and to sell arms with Bell. And Bell Helicopter made a lot of money out of the Vietnam War. And of course, Thích Nhất Hạnh, he was probably caught in the middle of that, perhaps without realising, at least not in the early days, that there were these globalist interests in the military-industrial complex, which were orchestrating all of this. And he was just saying in the middle of it, look, I don't want anything to do with you guys. I just want to be peaceful. And he wants to essentially end suffering. And that brings me to the idea of suffering, that this is part of studying Buddhism. You recognise that there's always going to be suffering. And, one of the ways to deal with this is, A, to recognise that there's suffering, going on, which is kind of obvious. You kind of you know that. But the way that he describes it, I suppose, is that you then realise that if there's a state of suffering, then there must also be a state of not suffering, else you wouldn't have a word for suffering.
Yeah.
So you then get into this idea of the duality of things, and he was saying I think there was some video that I watched of him where he's addressing some political groups, and he's sort of saying, well, you consider yourselves a left-wing group, for example, but you do need this right wing, because if there was no right wing, you wouldn't be able to identify as left wing. So it's kind of obvious stuff, but I think what he's saying is you've got to accept that there is this duality between left and right, between light and dark, between suffering and non-suffering. And once you kind of accept that, then it changes your thought processes a bit, and you can kind of more, you can process things differently. It shifts the way that you think about things. And I'd already sort of thought a bit about that, and some of that comes up. Like the yin yang symbol, where you've got that sort of, you maybe bring that on the screen, and within that you've got this little light circle, white circle in the black, and you've got a black circle in the white. So you've got a little bit of darkness in the light and a little bit of light in the darkness. And that's how things are. That's how it's always been, and it's quite symbolic of that. And so I think, to me, again, Thích Nhất Hạnh doesn't talk about that symbol. But to me, what he was saying was very much related to that. So you get these concepts reoccurring. And like with what we're doing, we consider ourselves to be light workers, or on the light side, where we're looking at the light side and trying to bring that light in one way or another. Whereas the Shamestream media, we would say, well, they're working for the forces of darkness. Yes. They're on the dark side. Well, primarily, of course, again, I'm making sort of fairly sweeping statements.
Probably mostly they're not realising that they are, but it's
exactly.
Again, isn't it?
Exactly. So again, if they could each get into this state of divorcing themselves from their reality for a bit through meditation or whatever, and objectively observing what's going on, maybe they themselves would realise more truthfully, what's actually going on.